G'day everyone. Tonight we had some problems with the sound, with the video, with Tim not being able to make it, and the show went on anyway. Party faithful Todd Everingham agreed at short notice to jump on and do the show with me. I just wanted to do a quick intro saying that we have the website at australianemploymentparty.org. That's australianemploymentparty.org. You can tweet at the hashtag hash ozmmt, that's ozmmt, and I am at Ian Dooley on Twitter. Tim Jones, who is the other co-founder of the party, is at Fourth Left 2. Todd, who is joining us tonight, is at The Sizzle News, but sizzle without an E. And you can also search on Facebook for Australian Employment Party and join the Facebook group. We'd love to have you on there. And don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel and share it around and spread the word so that we can get our membership and get registered. Okay, thanks a lot and enjoy the show. And the topic for today is that there is no government debt.
Okay, so a lot of people would be surprised to hear you say that, Ian, because all we hear from the politicians all the time is the need to reduce the government debt and deficit. So is it possible for you to explain what you mean by that statement?
Yeah, so I think that I'd like to start with an analogy again, and it's a really simple one that everyone should be able to understand because we all have bank accounts. And you know that if you have a bank account with your bank and say you had $100,000 in the bank, it's never happened to me, but I've heard it happens to some people. So you've got all this cash in the bank and you go, oh, well, I don't need all that cash right away, so I can put it in a term deposit. And when I put it in a term deposit, I can't use it for 12 months, but in return for that, the bank's going to pay me some interest. And when I get access to the money again in 12 months' time, I'll have more money than I started with. So if I were to describe that to you, would you say that the bank has say I had $100,000 in and I put $50,000 in a term deposit? Would you say that the bank has borrowed $50,000 from me?
No.
Right. Why not? Why haven't they borrowed my money?
Because you've given it to them to look after, basically, and they're just making money off it while it sits there.
Right, so they need to have the money in there for their own operational reasons.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's for their own benefit, you know?
Yeah. So the other reason I would say that they haven't borrowed money from me is because they already had the money.
Well, that's it. Well, the money was there. Your money was there, but you're the one. Unless you put it in the term deposit, then you've got control over it, haven't you?
Right. So I've relinquished control. I'm just going to get rid of this moth. Okay. Yeah, you're right. So I've relinquished control over that money. But one thing that Randall Wray, who is one of my favorite economists, I've read his book Modern Money Theory and I found it very accessible. One of the things he always says is that his mentor and teacher, Hyman Minsky, told him to discipline his analysis with balance sheets. So that's where he always starts with balance sheets. And what that does is it kind of clarifies a lot of this language which can get confusing because we've got all these terminology problems. But if you start by looking at what's happening when you have a deposit at the bank, it kind of makes things a little bit clearer. So if I say I take a $5 note to the bank and I give it to them, they give me a deposit account. And the deposit account is their liability and my asset. So I've given them some money and they owe it back to me. So that debt that they owe me is my asset and their liability. So the money sitting in my demand deposit account is a liability of the bank. When I put it into a term deposit, it's the same liability of the bank. They still owe me the money. It's just they don't owe it to me right away. they've changed the terms of the debt that already existed to me. They already owed me $5. Now I'm just saying, okay, I put it in a term deposit. I can't get it right away, but you still owe it to me.
It's a lot clearer way of looking at it. I wouldn't have thought of it like that before. It it's a lot clearer. And I hadn't thought of that. No.
Right. So
it is still the same.
So they've taken the money that they already owed me. They owed me that money, and they've moved it into a different kind of account. So how could they have borrowed money from me? Because a borrowing operation, if I have no money, which is actually closer to the truth, rather than the $100,000 in the bank. So I have no money. I borrow money from you. I say I need to put petrol in my car. I got to get to work. Can you lend me $20? And you say, okay, cool. And I say, listen, I'm going to earn money while I'm at work. So because you won't have the $20 until tomorrow, and I'm going to make some money from it, I'll pay you back $22 tomorrow. Now that is definitely a borrowing operation because my liabilities have changed, and your assets have changed. But in the case of a borrowing operation needs to have a change of liability. Someone has to owe someone money they didn't owe them before. But changing the timing of when that money is owed, how could you call that a borrowing operation? It's like saying, I already owe you $20. So the next day, I borrowed the $20 from you yesterday. I went to work, I filled up the petrol, whatever, but they didn't pay me yet. So I say, hey, I'm going to have to pay you back tomorrow, the next day. I'm going to pay you back Thursday or whatever. Am I borrowing an extra $5? Am I borrowing an extra $20 from you? No, I'm not borrowing more money. I already owe you the money.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. It's good when you put it in an everyday analogy like that. The question is, I suppose, that some people might ask is, how does this apply to the government? I mean, we're talking about everyday things here, with banks or with me lending you money or vice versa. How is this applicable to the government and their balance sheet?
Right, so it's it's interesting you ask that because one of the main things we try to avoid in MMT is using everyday analogies to describe the government because one of the worst ones is describing the government as a household budget, and then that just leads to all sorts of problems. But in this case, it's actually quite accurate because what we need to unpack there is the statement that when I gave the bank some money, they owed me the money, and the account that I hold with the bank is their liability and my asset. So we need to look at that word liability and realize that all money is actually a liability of the government. The government, when it issues currency, is handing out IOUs. Now, back in the day when money was first created, a paper currency was an IOU for the gold currency. So it was all currency. There wasn't an IOU for gold initially, at least in medieval England. It was an IOU for that number of pennies or that number of pounds, right? A £5 note meant that you could go and get that number of pennies back from the exchequer or whoever was doing it. So paper money is an IOU. But even earlier, like if you can go further back in history and sort of imagine the very beginning of money, people imagine that there was this barter society and everyone was swapping their pigs and their cows and whatever, and magically someone decided, okay, we're going to use silver to trade now. And that was then somehow easier, and then all of a sudden the government came along and started meddling. So what's much closer to the truth is that successful currencies have always been a result of a sovereign imposition. So you imagine a world with no money, and then this tribal leader wakes up one day and says, we've got crops, we need to protect them, I want to wage war on someone else. And so I'm going to say that everyone has to send their sons to my army this year. So he does that. And the next year, he wants to do the same thing, and it just becomes this normal thing that every year everyone who turns a certain age owes military service to this leader who is going to go and fight a war. But then one year, he goes, I need everyone to do something else this year, so I'm going to hand out this token that says that if they do this thing for me this year, maybe it's like build a temple or something, then they don't have to do the military service next year. If they do this extra work for me, I'm going to give them a token. What that token represents is a debt that the government owes the people of an exemption from a future imposition that they were going to kind of impose upon them. So if you imagine that that's the inception of money, then all money really is a debt.
It's very interesting. I don't think I've got my head around that quite yet. So what you're saying is that if the government gives me money, question is it the debt of the government or is it my debt?
It's a liability of the government and your asset.
Oh, right.
Because you can use it in the future to redeem some obligation.
Right, yes, I've got you.
So most obligations in our society now are taxes, fines, import duties, all that kind of stuff. But you can imagine that in the very first creation of money, before money existed, that really what it was, the money was a debt to be redeemed against some future obligation. And that's all it really is now. I mean, the wheels are well and truly in motion now with money. It's very different now in terms of the specific liabilities, but it's still a liability of the government. So in one sense, all money is debt. So anyone who says, we need debt-free money, that's not possible. Currency is always a liability of the person who issues the currency. The reason I say that there is no government debt, even though all money is technically debt, is twofold. Firstly, when like the government and the economists and everyone uses the word debt, what they're referring to is reserves on which the government has chosen to pay interest, meaning like bonds and securities, which are no different from term deposits that you have in a normal bank. So they call one type of reserves or one type of money debt, and then they don't call just all money debt. So that's a really confusing thing to do. The other reason I like to say that there is no government debt is because the experience that the government has of being in debt is very different from the experience that you and I have of being in debt. I mean, your experience of being in debt is that you borrow money to spend something today, and then you got to pay it back, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I've had a bit too much experience with debt, I think.
Yeah.
But I see what you're saying. That's right, and it's interesting because you do hear the government use that analogy a lot. The household debt is like a government debt. But listening to you, I can see that that's not the case.
Yeah, so if you then sort of free yourself up from the terminology, I think the problem is that when people talk about government borrowing and government debt, even though technically, by some technical definition, government securities are government debt, just the same way that all money is government debt. But that using the same word for the government's debt as we use for private debt, for our own debts, is really misleading because it's quite stressful for you and me to be in debt. I mean, I hate it. Everyone hates debt. Like, they got the mortgage to pay, there's like mortgage stress, credit cards, the debt collectors calling up, and it's when governments use that term, debt, the imagination of people is that somehow there's a credit guy who's going to come and beat down our door and somehow bankrupt the government and like take over the government or something. I don't know what, like Omnicorp or whatever in RoboCop takes over Detroit. So that's completely not going to happen, and it can't happen to a government.
Interesting thing you brought to my mind there when you were talking about who the government could be owing money to. It made me think about the recent talk about the Moody's credit downgrade, and everyone was saying, "Oh no, Moody's is going to downgrade the government. That's going to mean we can't borrow anymore." But what you're saying is the government isn't really borrowing in the first place anyway.
Right.
That's my understanding.
Yeah, so the Moody's thing, man, that is crazy. Firstly, I can't believe we're still listening to those guys. Right? Because they're the ones that rated the things, the prime mortgage crisis things, the CDOs, and all the other junk that was going around there. They rated them AAA. So who is listening to them still? Come on, how are they even still around? Second, so that's a really interesting thing, because that conjures up this image that somehow, because the government is deficit spending, and this is like the deficit debt connection, people somehow have this imagination that because the government is deficit spending, they have to borrow some money to kind of make up the shortfall. And which is because that's what we have to do. If we spend more in 1 month than our income, we've got to get the money from somewhere. And usually it's a credit card or, your friends or something. And that's what we have to do. So it conjures up all these images of that the government will be able to not spend in 3 years' time if they run out of the ability to borrow. Now that might be true of countries that have given up their right to issue their own currency, like the countries in the Eurozone. That's a different story. But in Australia, we don't borrow in order to fund operations. In fact, when we sell bonds, when the government sells bonds, what it does is it drains reserves from the banking system. So just the same way, if you can imagine that a bond is like a term deposit at your bank, and then imagine that the bank sells you a term deposit. They kind of do. I mean, they don't call it that, but they call it like taking out a term deposit or whatever. But the language is different, but the concept is the same. When the government sells a bond, it's no different from you transferring money into a term deposit. And the difference is that you can't go and then sell your term deposit to someone else. But bonds can be traded in different ways, in ways that term deposits can't. But it doesn't change like the mechanics of it. So what it does, just the same way that when you had $100,000 in the bank account and you sold, you put $50,000 in a term deposit. Now you can't take out the full 100. You can only take out 50. So it's drained the amount of money in that little microcosm. So that little banking system, your bank account system. Now you imagine the whole banking reserve system has lots and lots of dollars floating around in it, and everyone's got these reserves and whatever. When all settlements between banks have to happen in reserves. So the money that people use to buy bonds when the government sells them just reduces the amount of reserves total in the system, which doesn't sound like borrowing at all.
No, it doesn't. No. Totally puts things on its head when you think of it like that. It's definitely a good analogy to equating bonds with the term deposit. The bonds are a bit scary. People think, the government's sold $12 billion worth of bonds or something the other day. That you're saying it's not the end of the world after all.
Yeah, in fact, the reason that they do it mostly is just to control the interest rate. So there's a whole the hard thing about this topic is that the mechanics of how bonds are bought and sold is really confusing. If you go onto the Australian Office of Financial Management's website, it is indigestible. You can't read it. It's so hard. I want to get in touch with one of the prominent MMT economists in the country and really nail this stuff. Because there's like primary bond market, and that's new issuance, and then there's the secondary bond market, and it's the secondary bond market that they use to control the interest rate, but it's the bond issuance that they use to control the amount of reserves in the system, or whatever. And then the Australian Office of Financial Management issues these bonds always to soak up any excess reserves in the system at the end of a budget year. It's crazy. Like, seriously, it's so complex. And what's hard to explain to people is that all of this whole system that we're using to do all these complex operations only exists as sort of a self-imposed constraint. So I like to liken it to when I was at uni and I would go out drinking, I would leave my ATM card at home because I knew I didn't trust myself once I got drunk to to exercise any restraint. Am I the only one who's ever done that?
No, I've done that many times when I was at uni.
Right.
Myself, yeah, not alone there, that's true.
So it's sort of like we have this complex system set up as a way of constraining artificially the ability of governments to sort of spend, I don't know, accidentally or on purpose in a corrupt way, or without budgetary oversight and all these types of things. But I don't want people to kind of get confused too much by all the different types of bonds that you can buy and all the different words that they use and all these different mechanisms, because when it comes down to it, the reality of bonds are that they just are term deposits. And the very simple way to kind of prove that is, again, from the Reserve Bank of Australia's website. It describes how settlement works between banks. So when banks create deposits, they say they lend you $100,000 to buy a boat. They've created that money out of thin air, but they didn't create the reserves. They can't create reserves. Now, if you go and transfer the $100,000 into some guy's bank account to buy the boat, at the end of the day, the bank that your bank, CBA, say, has to transfer $100,000 in reserves to the other guy's bank, unless someone else paid for something the other way. So at the end of each day, banks are settling up between each other, and they do that with reserves, or it's also called exchange settlement funds, and that's what the government creates when it spends. So the real money in the system, or the high-powered money, as it's called, is these reserves. That's the only thing that someone can use to buy bonds with. But you can't, so even if you borrowed money from the bank and you were crazy enough to go and buy lower interest yielding bonds than the interest you were paying, if you could do that if you wanted, the bank would actually have to use reserves to buy the bonds. So the reserves already existed, they were already a liability of the government, and they're just being shifted into a spending constrained account that means that they can't be used for interbank settlements anymore. So whatever the mechanisms that are, or the reasoning, or the policy, whatever's going on, the reality of it is that the money already existed, it was already a liability of the government, and that what they refer to as a borrowing operation does not increase the liability of the government. So therefore it cannot be termed extra borrowing.
Right, I've got you. So when the government wants to spend money, does it just create money, or is this part of this bond function as well?
This is where it gets really confusing, because the reality of it is that when the government spends money, it does create money. But this Australian Office of Financial Management does have all these rules about borrowing, right, issuing bonds or buying bonds in the secondary market in response to or as a part of government spending operations. And they also borrow money sometimes. The Australian Office of Financial Management does borrow money short term from non-government banks if they can't sell the bonds that day or whatever, or they can't buy the bonds. So that's a confusing thing. But if you go through that sort of artificial complexity, that is really just a system of administrative constraints that have been self-imposed. It's similar to, have you ever heard of the debt ceiling in the US?
Yes, and didn't we have that briefly instituted here by the last Labor government? Well,
Did we? I didn't know.
I'm pretty sure that we did, and then it was removed, I think, by the current government. And yeah, I guess for the same reason, just I think it was to try and make the government look responsible or something like that.
Right. Yeah, so that's when Randall Wray talks about that in the US, he describes it as being a self-imposed constraint. It's not a fundamental fact of the system that has to exist. It's just something that they've set up arbitrarily to change the way that things operate, or constrain them in some way. And there's also then in the US this crazy system of private bank accounts that the government uses to tax people and transfer spending and do all this stuff. So if you go and read about it, it kind of looks as though the government is using private banks. And the same thing goes here with the Australian Office of Financial Management. It's very bamboozling. But if we go back to the basics of it, you go to the Reserve Bank of Australia's domestic market operations page and you search for the word expenditure. And it says there, expenditure by the government credits ES funds and tax receipts have the opposite effect. And so that's the simplest description of what's going on when the government spends in taxes. ES funds are exchange settlement funds, also called reserves, also called high-powered money. It's what the bank needs if they want to convert to notes and coins. It's what banks need when they settle up between each other. It's what's used to buy government securities. So that's if you cut through all of the operational kind of noise, at the bottom of it, when the government spends, they're creating money. When they tax, they're destroying it. And the bond market, what they call borrowing, is nothing to do with funding that expenditure.
It's quite interesting to hear you say that taxes are destroyed. I think a lot of people, we tend to think taxes are what's used for the government to spend money. And, you hear politicians are always saying, oh, we need taxes to fund this and to fund that and whatever. And it's, it turns the whole idea on its head,
Yeah, so the taxes, the government, the fact that taxes don't pay for things, actually this is a good time to mention that we covered that in our first episode. So the first episode is called Taxes Don't Pay for Things. Second one is called Deficits Are Good. And so then that leads on to that there is no government debt. So the fact that the model that is sort of presented to us in media, politicians, whatever, is that the government needs to raise taxes before it can spend. That if it spends too much, it needs to borrow the money from somewhere to cover the shortfall. And that at some point it's going to have to pay that money back. The reality of it is that the government is not constrained by taxation in how much it can spend. That taxes really serve the purpose of controlling inflation, controlling inequality, and incentivizing and disincentivizing behaviors. And then also, in that way that I was discussing, that money is a liability of the government, taxes drive a demand for currency. So in the very early days of a currency, if a government isn't imposing a liability, if you don't have a sovereign constitutional liability, it's very hard to get a currency to work. So in the early days of a currency, the ability of the sovereign to impose taxes more or less determines its ability to spend. Not because it needs the taxes before it can spend, but because no one will want its money if they don't have to pay taxes. So the actual order of operations, if you take it back to the start of currency, the order of operations is that the government has to spend before it can tax. Because if it hasn't spent, if it's a new currency and it hasn't spent any money, then no one has the money. So how could you raise the taxes? And so, but they've had, right. So they have to start by creating demand for that. So there was an interesting thing on that I didn't mention in that first episode, but I'll mention it now. I was around at my friend's place the other night, and they had this chart on their fridge with ticks on it, and it was like 10 ticks equals 15 minutes iPad time, and it was for their kids, you know. And so I said, "Oh, where do you get the ticks from?" And they were like, "What? What do you mean? We write them with a pen." And I was like, "Oh, right. What if you want them to do more chores this week? Where are you going to borrow the ticks from to make that happen?" And they were just like looking at me funny because I hadn't told them all this stuff, right? They just thought I was crazy, and they were looking at me like, "What do you mean borrow ticks? What are you talking about? We write them with we don't have to get them from it. We're writing them with a pen." And I was like, "Oh, right, okay." And when the kids come and get their iPad time, what do you do with the ticks that you collect? And they were just like, "All right, I think you've lost your mind. We just cross them off the sheet." Crazy. And then, of course, I then regaled them with modern monetary theory for an hour. So but that was like when we did it in that context, it seemed crazy that you would have to get the ticks before you spent the ticks. It seemed crazy that you would have to borrow the ticks from somewhere, and that somehow extra ticks this week meant that you had to pay back the ticks next week. And it seemed crazy that somehow you collected the ticks. So you can see how that works with the government's monetary system.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. I don't suppose it would win you too many invitations to dinner parties, but
no. I've become the worst dinner party guest ever since learning about modern monetary theory.
That really encapsulates how radical it seems to most people. You know, that idea of debt not being bad, not necessarily. Although there is one thing I wanted to put you up on. Before you mentioned that taxes are used to reduce inflation, but you also said the same of government bonds, in that they reduced liquidity. And
right.
That was also for that.
So you can reduce the total reserves in the system by selling bonds. And one of the primary reasons that they do that for a bunch of reasons, and some of them are good, some of them are bad, some of them are necessary, some of them are unnecessary. All of them are policy choices. We don't have to do it. That's the take-home message. But when you reduce reserves in the system, you don't necessarily reduce the amount of spending going on in the economy, because a lot of people have money that is actually created through bank deposits. It's created through private credit creation. So you can't just reduce the amount of reserves in the system and then have it reduce inflation. You have to actually specifically reduce people's spending power. So taxation reduces your spending power. You can't go out and spend that money because the government took it away. The reason they reduce the reserves is because, so this is kind of like going in a little bit into how reserve banking works. But so I said that the exchange settlement funds, banks use that to settle up between each other. So say the flows between NAB and Commonwealth every day, billions and billions of dollars. And it ends up that at the end of the day, after everyone's spent their money, the NAB owes the Commonwealth $1 million. They can't create a deposit to pay that $1 million off. They got to pay it with reserves. And if they don't have the reserves, they have to get the reserves from somewhere. So the only rule, there's no such thing as fractional reserve banking in this country. They don't have, they did implement it, but it used to just be that the banks had to have a non-negative reserve balance at the end of the day. That was the only rule. They've since introduced this thing called Basel III, which I think has reserve constraints. But basically that's also a policy choice. So the only thing that has to happen is that the bank has to get the money from somewhere to pay the Commonwealth. So the NAB has to, if it doesn't have the reserves, have to go and borrow the money from someone. Now that is borrowing, right? The liabilities and the assets are changing. So they might go to say the Commonwealth. Say the Commonwealth had a surplus that day. They had heaps of reserves. So they go to the Commonwealth and they say, hey, I need to borrow $1 million. I'm going to give it straight to you, but just lend it to me until tomorrow because I'm sure we'll settle up then. And they lend it at an interest rate. Now, the more money that everyone has, so say 50 banks, 49 of them had more reserves than they needed that day. And so the Commonwealth Bank, they're short $1 million. They go out to 49 banks and say, who wants to lend me $1 million? And all the banks are like, yeah, I'll lend you $1 million. I'll only charge you 4%. And someone else is like, I'll charge you 2%. I'll charge you 0.5%. Because there's so much money, everyone's like, I'll do it. And so then the Commonwealth gets their money really cheap. Now, if the government, for some reason, wants that interest rate higher, it reduces the amount of reserves in the system to the point at which everyone will only lend money at that rate by buying bonds at a certain by selling bonds at a certain interest rate. So that's that they use that as a mechanism for setting the interest rate that banks will lend to each other. It's a policy choice. The reasons that they do it are really complex and not even all that necessary. Randall Wray advocates a zero interest rate policy, whatever. But mechanically, aside from the politics of it, aside from why they're doing it, that's what's happening. So bond sales aren't necessarily a tool for reducing inflation, although the Australian Office of Financial Management issues new bonds in the primary market to soak up excess capacity that the government has spent. And that is seen as a de-inflationary measure. I don't know if it's an effective one or if it's a good choice, but that's my understanding of why they do it. It's certainly not a requirement.
I guess at the moment, inflation, the economy is generally looked at as the least of our worries because we actually have deflation at the moment. So, is there a way you could perhaps briefly explain how we increase deflation, get back to inflation? What does the government need to do there? Is that a matter of spending more?
Yeah, basically that's it. So the government needs to increase its deficits. It needs to increase the deficit, and it doesn't need to borrow money in order to do so. And if it increases its deficit this year, it doesn't have to borrow money to do that, and it doesn't have to pay back the money next year. There's no balancing the books. So you just have to, the whole debt borrowing thing and its relationship to deficits is, they're just disconnected. They're not connected. In the same way that taxation and spending aren't really connected, in that taxation and revenue don't have to be one-to-one. There's nothing that says you need to spend the amount you tax or that you need to tax the amount you spend. You just have to spend the right amount for the economy and tax the right amount for the economy. And that depends on a whole range of factors. If you've got deflation, you shouldn't be taxing more because that's deflationary. You should be spending more. If you want to adjust your interest rate, that's why you use bond sales. Both Bill Mitchell and Randall Wray have said publicly the government doesn't even need to sell bonds at all. It's something that they do because they've done it for a long time. When money was different, when they needed to get the coins back from the public, they needed bonds, right? They needed to get the gold, and they had to ship it off to pay the overseas armies and all these things. That is not what's happening now. And so really, Bill Mitchell calls it corporate welfare. He says that that the interest we pay on bonds is no different from Social Security payments, except for the fact that we're paying it to people who already have heaps of money. So, that kind of brings me back to that Moody's thing you were talking about with the credit rating. And the other really important thing about this is that if we take it back to the term deposit thing, you transfer your money to the term deposit, the bank says they will pay you interest on the term deposit. Now, the bank, when it pays interest, it just creates the deposits. right? Banks just create money when they give you the deposit. So they're just paying interest in a spreadsheet. They're just increasing the number in your account. And they might accidentally pay you $4 million like they did to that young lady in the paper the other day. And then you'll go out and spend it on handbags. so that, they just create, and it's the same thing with the government. Now, the only difference with a bank is that they can run out of reserves and then not be able to borrow some, so they have a problem. The government is the highest authority of the money. We float our exchange rate, we issue the currency, there's no default risk. So when we pay interest on bonds, we're just creating the money. It's no different from Social Security payments. So therefore, there is zero default risk. And what does a credit rating measure? A credit rating measures default. It's a measure of default risk. So how can you apply a credit rating to a government with zero default risk? It is absolutely nonsensical to do so. So the mood, and what is astounding is that every political party, every journalist, every commentator, everything I heard about that on the radio that week, no one said, this is ridiculous, there's no default risk. I don't know why we can't get the word out there.
I guess what it comes back to is it's probably a combination of two things. It's politicians not really being that well informed about how all this stuff really works, but it's also the nature of politics itself is to say, we're going to manage the economy better than the other guys. You can trust us for jobs and growth, while the other lobby are going to tax and spend. That's all. If that's what you need to do to get into power, then you're going to do it.
Yeah, it's true. It's true that you don't. It's hard to tell whether they genuinely are ignorant. I think some of them are, and how much of it is calculated, because it's a convenient fiction that can get people whipped up into a frenzy and drive votes.
Yeah, it certainly seems to work. I mean, you see over the years the debt trucks that politicians drive around.
No.
With the deficit trucks, whatever they are. And,
what are we up against?
Bogeyman. It is really the bogeyman.
Yeah. So I guess it's time to wrap it up. I know we were going to call this a dry run, but it went pretty well, and it's kind of late, so I think we should just post this. What do you reckon?
I think that's a great idea. I've really enjoyed it, and I hope you invite me back on again sometime in the future.
Yeah, great.
To do it again.
All right, I'm going to go back and record the intro that I should have done at the start, and then kind of phase it into our conversation with all of the website and stuff. But I'm going to say it again now. Website is AustralianEmploymentParty.org. The Facebook group, search Australian Employment Party. I am at Ian Dooley, IAINDOOLEY on Twitter. Tim Jones, the co-founder of the party, other co-founder, apart from myself, is at FourthLeft2 on Twitter, who sends his apologies he couldn't be here. And Todd, who we're speaking with tonight, is at Sizzle News, but it's Sizzle without an E, right?
Yeah, that's right. At the Sizzle News.
At the Sizzle News, but Sizzle without an E.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, right. So you had an E deficit. You had to borrow some E's.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks very much for standing in tonight, Todd, at such short notice. It's been great. And I'll see you on the group.
Great, will do. It's been a lot of fun.
Thanks. See ya.
See ya.